Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of history. We're going to look at how the greatest military conqueror of antiquity was halted, not by a rival army, but by the devastating limits of human endurance and logistics. We are focusing right in on the final, incredibly grueling stage of Alexander the Great's campaigns. So, what actually finally defeated the ancient world's greatest conqueror? What's wild about this is that the answer isn't some rival king, a superior phalanx, or even a massive empire. Actually, it was a hidden antagonist that literally stalked his every single step. We're talking about geography and the absolute breaking point of his own masterful supply chains. Section 1. The Edge of the World. Let's start right at the very edge of the known world, for the ancient Greeks. Because this is exactly where Alexander's previously flawless military machine started to show its first real cracks. The staggering problem he faced essentially comes down to sheer, mind-boggling distance. I mean, think about it. The Macedonian army had marched over 12,500 miles from Greece. That is halfway around the earth. They were stretching their fragile supply lines all the way across the jagged mountains of the Hindu Kush, right down into the Indus River Valley. The geographic scale here was just completely unprecedented. Now, to conquer that much territory, Alexander couldn't just rely on good battlefield tactics, right? He had to radically transform military logistics. He completely stripped down the slow-moving non-combatants and got rid of those clunky ox carts. Instead, he forced his soldiers to carry up to a 30-day supply of flour and equipment. That's about 36 kilograms. Imagine strapping a large dog to your back and just marching. He also brought in camels, which could carry 300 pounds of supplies across arid deserts without needing much water, and he heavily relied on river routes and advanced messengers to secure provisions. The whole system was built for lightning-fast speed and total mobility. But by 326 BC, deep into his Indian campaign, this finely tuned machine faced its absolute bloodiest test at the Battle of the Hydaspes in the Punjab. Here, Alexander crashed head-on into the formidable Indian King Porus and his devastating war elephants. It was an absolute slaughter. It resulted in terrible casualties for the Macedonians, making it arguably his most costly battle ever. Yet somehow, Alexander still won. And when the wounded King Porus, who, by the way, supposedly stood over 6.5 feet tall, was brought before him, he delivered this legendary line: "Treat me, Alexander, the way a king treats another king." Alexander was so profoundly impressed by his bravery and his towering stature that he didn't just grant him clemency, he actually expanded Porus's territory. He knew that being this far from home, turning a brilliant enemy into a strategic local ally was literally the only way to hold the region. Section 2. Mutiny at the Hyphasis. So, the crucial point here is that while Alexander was completely fired up to push even further east to find what the Greeks believed was the ocean at the edge of the world, his exhausted men had very, very different plans. These guys were incredibly homesick after 8 straight years of fighting. And then they start hearing these terrifying rumors about the colossal Nanda and Gangvar empires waiting for them just past the Ganges River. We are talking about reports of 200,000 infantry and 6,000 war elephants. After barely surviving the elephants they just fought at the Hydaspes, the Macedonian soldiers realized they were marching straight into a meat grinder. The ancient historian Arrian captures this moment perfectly. At the Hyphasis River, the psychological and physical strain finally hit its absolute peak. The men snapped. They violently opposed him and just flat out refused to take another step east. Alexander was furious. Absolutely livid, but without his army, he was powerless. He was forced to abandon his ultimate dream and turn the entire army southward. Section 3. The Gedrosian Desert Trek. Let's move to the next chapter and see how this forced retreat triggered a logistical collapse that almost wiped out his entire force. So, Alexander decides to divide his retreating forces. His admiral, Nearchus, takes part of the army by sea to explore the Persian Gulf, while Alexander leads the rest by land through the notoriously unforgiving Gedrosian Desert. And here is where it all falls apart. His proven strategy of river fleets and advanced supply drops completely collapsed. Instead of fertile terrain, they faced scorched earth, extreme heat, and total starvation. The army was completely stranded without supplies and totally out of their element. They started encountering these isolated coastal tribes, like the ichthyophagi, or the fish eaters,
who lived in huts made literally out of whale bones and survived entirely on raw seafood. Running into this just highlights how far off the map the Macedonians truly were. They had merged right out of the fertile agricultural zones their supply chains completely depended on.
And the horror of this retreat cannot be overstated. The great conqueror fought absolutely zero human enemies in the Judrosian desert, but he suffered enormous casualties anyway, almost entirely from thirst and hunger. The baggage train and military discipline just completely shattered. In a desperate, highly theatrical attempt to salvage morale, when someone offered Alexander a helmet filled with precious, scarce water, he refused it. He poured it right out into the sand to prove he was willing to suffer right there alongside his dying men. Section 4. Death in Babylon. Miraculously, he survives the horrors of the desert and finally returns to Persia, only to find that his vast, newly forged empire is already unraveling in his absence. After spending some time executing corrupt governors who had sort of gone rogue while he was away, and putting down yet another troop mutiny at Opis, the young king arrives in Babylon. He fully intended to make this incredibly wealthy city his grand capital. But, in a brutal twist of irony, after surviving decades of bloody, close-quarters combat and blistering deserts, on June 10, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died of a sudden illness. He was only 32 years old. His sudden death sent an immediate, massive shockwave across the known world. Contemporaries powerfully described this massive, suddenly leaderless Macedonian army as a blinded cyclops. I love that metaphor. Without Alexander's visionary eye and unmatched logistical mind guiding them, this incredible military machine was just blindly stumbling, groping wildly into total chaos. Section 5. A Fractured Empire. And this brings us to the bloody finale. The empire that had been meticulously carved out by logistics and sheer genius was about to be brutally torn apart by ambition. You see, Alexander left absolutely no clear succession plan. He died leaving behind only his pregnant wife, Roxana, and his half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus. A frantic, super fragile compromise was drawn up in Babylon to basically share power between his unborn son and his half-brother. But let's be real, it was doomed from the very start. His power-hungry generals, knowing the sheer amount of wealth and land at stake, immediately began carving up the territories for themselves. Over the next 4 decades, these generals, known as the Diadochi, or the successors, waged relentless, brutal civil wars. It's a timeline of absolute destruction. You've got the assassination of the regent Perdiccas in 321 BC, the murder of Alexander's half-brother, and finally the tragic assassination of Alexander's young heir and wife by Cassander in 310 BC. Alexander's entire bloodline was wiped out, and by the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, his unified vision was permanently shattered. But out of the ashes of this massive civil war, the map of the ancient world was totally rewritten. The fractured empire finally settled into 3 distinct, stable Hellenistic kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria and Persia, and Antigonid Macedonia. So, while the unified empire was dead, these 3 power blocks would actually go on to dominate the ancient world and spread Greek culture, language, and trade for centuries to come. So, wrapping this all up, Alexander the Great built the largest empire the world had ever seen through unmatched military brilliance and an incredibly innovative mastery of logistics. But ultimately, the sheer exhaustion of his men, the unyielding, brutal geography of the deserts and rivers, and his total failure to secure a line of succession proved to be the 3 enemies he simply couldn't outmaneuver. Which leaves us with this final, tantalizing thought to ponder today. If the logistical limits of the ancient world hadn't snapped his army's spirit at the Hyphasis River, and if he hadn't been forced into that grueling desert retreat, how much more of the world would be speaking Greek today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning history.